Charter Schools in Alberta, Change or Continuity in Progressive Conservative Education Policy by Dr. Michael Wagner, as published in the Alberta Journal of Educational Research, Spring 1999. The Progressive Conservative government of Premier Ralph Klein undertook an ambitious program of educational restructuring. Among other changes, the government provided for the establishment of charter schools in the province. This was the first time that charter schools were allowed in Canada and led to a number of observers to allege that this was a step towards privatization of public education in Alberta. In other words, a radical change was taking place. However, a careful look at the educational policy of Alberta's PC government reveals that it has consistently been favorable to private and quasi-private alternatives to public education. Many different policy decisions since the 1970s demonstrate this to be the case. And rather than being a radical change then, the introduction of charter schools is simply an extension of the PC's government's long-standing policy of promoting educational choice. The province of Alberta experienced a significant policy change in 1971 when the Progressive Conservative Party under Peter Lougheed unseated the ruling Social Credit Party in a provincial election. Social Credit, a populist relic of the Depression era, had been in power in Alberta continuously since 1935. The Progressive Conservative PC Party subsequently remained the ruling party for many years. By the late 1980s, however, under a new premier, Donald Getty, the electoral support for the PC party was eroding, and the Alberta Liberal Party threatened to end the PC reign. With the disaster in the air, Getty resigned in 1992, and a new leader, Ralph Klein, was chosen. By promising to make major changes in government and giving evidence that his promises were genuine, Klein was able to rejuvenate the PC party and win the 1993 provincial election, a feat that only months earlier had looked impossible. Klein's administration then quickly embarked on a dramatic policy of deficit reduction and government restructuring that involved cutbacks in every government department, including the Department of Education. Along with the cutbacks, other changes were also made in education. These were discussed in Alberta Education's 1994 three-year business plan, which noted that the changes outlined in this plan will alter substantially the character of the education system and ensure a bright future for our students. Page 3. Among the changes were a significant reduction in the number of school jurisdictions, increased provincial control of educational funding, reduction of funding for early childhood services, ECS, and the introduction of charter schools. Although these were all controversial to varying degrees, charter schools were seen by many critics as an open door to the privatization of education. Charter schools are independent public schools. Instead of being operated by a school board like regular public schools, charter schools are run by organizations with a specific educational ideal that differs somewhat from the program of education offered by the school boards. The organizations must apply to a school board for the permission to operate a school, but if the permission is denied, they can apply directly to the Department of Education. The charter organizations are not directly accountable to the public as the school boards are, even though their schools are publicly funded. Because these schools are run by private organizations with particular educational agendas, they resemble private schools. Allowing them to operate in public education then has been interpreted by some observers as a move towards the privatization of education in Alberta. The Alberta Teachers Association, ATA, was quite outspoken about its concern in this regard. Buski, 1995, the secretary of the ATA, stated his view that charter schools are the thin edge of a wedge in privatizing education. Page 30. ATA President McKay, 1994, agreed, saying, "The government plan is to privatize charter schools and the hidden voucher system, funding following the student, along with a centralized taxation, clearly point towards privatization." Page 33. It was not just the ATA that held this concern. Journalist Lisek, 1995, for example, after noting that the business plan called for the creation of charter schools and mandatory school councils, said that these proposals left the door open for an eventual manipulation of the school system away from public education and towards private schools, page 191. Some academic writing has the same thrust. After referring to the proposals for charter schools, the alleged deregulation of teachers' labor, and the possibility of privatizing custodial work and school management, Robertson, Sosek, Panu, and Shugowski, 1995 state, together these initiatives move the public provision of education firmly into the private sector, page 89. Furthermore, after referring to the purpose of charter schools as creating competition between schools and increasing choice for parents, they make the following comment about the Klein government's 1994 bill to amend the School Act. In this sense, Bill 19 in Alberta does represent a clear step towards the privatization of schooling provision and ultimately differentiation between schools on the basis of parents' ability to pay, page 93. However, it is a mistake to see the Klein administration as making a sudden move towards educational privatization. From the PC government's first term in power in the early 1970s, it has demonstrated an openness to consider and sometimes adopt policies that promote private and quasi-private alternatives to traditional public education. Charter schools are simply a logical extension of emphasis on school choice that has been a hallmark of the PC's education policy. Thus, the Klein administration's acceptance of charter schools is a manifestation of continuity with the previous PC administrators rather than a move in a different direction. By examining PC government policy towards alternative schools, private school funding, homeschools, and the School Act of 1998, it becomes clear that there has been a consistent direction in support of school choice. Why this has been so is another question that cannot be dealt with here. Those who are interested in this latter question are referred to one attempt to explain the continuity of PC education policy generally in Wagner, 1998. The great difficulty in dealing with this aspect of education policy is in organizing the tremendous amount of information resulting from a multitude of government initiatives in this area. Beginning in the late 1970s, extending through much of the 1980s, issues related to private education were frequently in the public eye. There were a number of pertinent court cases, some government, some non-government reports, as well as an eventual successful effort to rewrite the School Act. Much of this was ongoing at the same time, and many of the events were related in some way. Nevertheless, the events are recounted separately in order to make sense of them and the impact they had. In the end, it should be quite clear that these events, separately and together, point towards the PC government's support of private and quasi-private alternatives in education. One point that needs to be made at the outset, however, is that Alberta was not alone in dealing with these kinds of issues at the time. A number of other provinces, notably British Columbia and Saskatchewan, also encountered a rising interest in private schools and made changes that encourage educational choice. For example, the government of British Columbia made funding private schools in 1987, Bergen, 1990, page 12. A renewed interest in private education and educational choice was also apparent in the United States and Britain. This international trend may have been shaped by an increase in conservatism in Western countries that had led to the election of conservative political leaders such as Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. The increasing pluralism in many Western countries may have been another contributing factor. Methodology and design. This article relies primarily on the three sources of data for its analysis: government documents explaining the government policies and the public rationales for those policies, regulative and legislative changes that enact certain aspects of the government program, and a review of the printed material, both the mainstream and educational press, to develop an indication of public reaction and controversy that accompanied the government's policy. The first source provides an official government perspective. The second provides an empirical benchmark for the change. And the third provides, at least sometimes, an alternative perspective to that offered by the government. It is important to note that this article is a condensed chapter from a doctoral dissertation that covers the broad scope of educational policy in Alberta under the PCs, Wagner 1998. The dissertation research includes interviews with key actors in Alberta educational policy, including 3 former PC education ministers. Although the interview touches on PC policy regarding the educational choice, they do not specifically focus on it. And to the degree that it was discussed, there was support for the thesis argued in this article. However, because educational choice was only one among a number of topics discussed in the interview, I decided to err on the side of caution and not rely on the interviews for the argument of this article. Alternative schools. During the PC's government's first term in power, 1971 to 1975, private school supporters were lobbying the government to increase grants to private schools. The social credit government had initiated funding of private schools in 1967, but the per pupil grant, which began at $100, were relatively small. The private school lobby wanted more, and although there was some support in the PC caucus to increase these grants, there was also plenty of opposition. As a result, the first PC education minister, Lou Hindman, tried to reach a compromise. He developed the umbrella concept, whereby private schools would come under the umbrella of control of the public system and thereby receive full government funding. This would also achieve another goal of his, which was to make public system more accommodating to the diverse demands of parents. But most importantly, the umbrella concept seemed to be a way to keep both supporters and opponents of increased private school funding happy. It would obtain sufficient funding for private schools, but at the same time reduce their identity as private schools and make them a de facto kind of public school. Sloan, 1980. There was little success for the umbrella concept as it was originally conceived. In a number of cases, private schools entered into talks with local private or separate boards, but only one resulted in an agreement that was approved by the Minister of Education. This was between the County of Camrose and the Camrose Lutheran College. All other discussions failed to reach agreement, or in one case, the agreement was not approved by the Department of Education. However, a variation of the umbrella concept developed into the alternative school concept, Sloan, 1980. In January 1975, the Talmud Torah Private School entered into negotiations with the Edmonton Public School Board, EPSB, in order to attain associate status under the umbrella concept. However, the superintendent of the EPSB, M.A. Strembitsky, insisted that any agreement between the private school and the board would leave the board with the ultimate authority over the school. Under these terms, an agreement was reached between the school and EPSB so that the school became an alternative school in the public system. As a result of this agreement, the board of the Talmud Torah School became an advisory committee to the EPSB's administration with regard to the staffing and operation of the school, Sloan, 1980. Thus, the alternative concept became into formal acceptance in Alberta. In 1976, the Calgary Board of Education, CBE, adopted a policy that encouraged the creation of alternative schools. 2 Jewish private schools, the Calgary Hebrew School and the I.L. Peretz School, requested and received status as alternative schools. Many aspects of these schools' daily operation included class size, curricula, and administration had to be changed for them to receive their new status. Calgary Hebrew School and I.L. Peretz School Association, 1984. Thus, in Edmonton and Calgary, Jewish private schools accommodate themselves to the necessary requirements in order to become alternative schools and to be fully funded by the government. It is important to note that legislative changes were necessary to make the umbrella concept and alternative schools become a reality. Bill 43, the School Amendment Act of 1975, was introduced and passed to make the necessary changes to the School Act, among other things. In introducing the bill for a second reading, the Minister of Education, Julian Kozak, noted the following: "This will permit the type of agreements we've been reading about, Mr. Speaker, where schools, particularly in Edmonton and Calgary, that are presently private schools, through arrangements being made, I think in most cases with the public school board, Mr. Speaker, are to come under the umbrella of the public school system." Alberta, Hansard, 1975, page 1127. Thus, the alternative school concept was a distinctly PC policy idea implemented through changes to the Alberta School Act. Through the PC government's desire to help private schools and develop more choice and flexibility in the public system, this new concept was developed. An alternative in practice. Alternative schools in practice. The umbrella concept that led some private schools to become alternative schools also led to the establishment of alternative schools that had no prior existence. A group of Protestant parents in Calgary organized the Logos Educational Society of Alberta in July 1977 with the intent of founding Protestant-based alternative schools in the Calgary public school system. Their proposal was accepted by the CBE in December 1977, and their first school opened in September 1979 with 300 students. Logos Christian School, 1984. The Logos schools proved to be quite popular, and increasingly demand led to plans to open more schools. However, the growth of Logos also generated significant public opposition and controversy. Opponents saw it as a sectarian institution that was drawing money away from regular public schools. In midst of this controversy in Calgary, the Edmonton Public School Board, EPSB, rejected a proposal by the Protestant group in Edmonton requesting an alternative school. At this time, Education Minister Dave King spoke in favor of the alternative school concept, stating that if school board would not accommodate divergent views, the provincial government would be happy to help new private schools develop. Weatherby and Wilford, 1982. The opposition in Calgary increased to such a point that new school trustees elected in October 1983 decided to terminate the contracts of religious alternative schools as of June 1984. Although the Jewish schools were able to cover over to the Calgary Catholic Board of Education and continue operating, the Logos schools disappeared. Miller, 1986. The point is, however, that the PC government initiated an alternative school concept as a way of accommodating demands for an increased government funding for private schools. Charter schools can be seen as a logical extension of the alternative school concept, but given the added strength of being able to circumvent a school board that is unfriendly, such as happened in Calgary. That is, charter schools can be chartered directly with the Department of Education. But the continuity in PC policy should be evident. Government funding of private schools. Although the umbrella concept and the alternative schools that resulted were initiated as a way to satisfy the private school lobby, the failure of many private schools to reach agreements with local boards of education led to continued lobbying for increased public funding for private schools. The per pupil grant to private schools had been increased on an annual basis and reached $172 in 1973. The following year, the method for determining grants for private schools was changed, and grants were made to be a percentage of the School Foundation Program Fund, the SFPF, that the public schools received. As well, the requirement to receive government grants were made easier. For 1974 and 1975, private schools could receive 33.3% of the SFPF, but this was increased to 40% in 1976 and increased each year thereafter until 1980. Sloan, 1980. The Edmonton Society for Christian Education, ESCE, was one of the private school groups that had been unsuccessful in working out an umbrella agreement with its local school board. During its negotiation with the board, it had kept the Minister of Education informed of developments. But because agreements was not forthcoming, it submitted a brief to him in 1976 calling for the government to raise the grant to private schools from 40% to 80% of the SFPF grant. It also just suggested that this could be phased in over a few years. Apparently, the idea was accepted because the government began increasing the grant each year and adopted a stated goal of 80% as the group requested. It may also be worthwhile to note that a number of ESCE people became politically active in support of their MLAs and that the MLA's support of the group's request for funding increased funding. Sloan, 1980. Thus, the lobby of the private school supporters for an increase in government financial support for private school had two results. The funding was increased as requested, but the alternative school concept was also implemented in the province. Thus, the perspective of private school supporters, the PC government had responded in two positive ways. The government was favorable to the private schools. In fact, the Education Minister, Dave King, went so far as to publicly announce his support for an experiment with the voucher system in Alberta. This would entail parents being able to direct the per-pupil grants for their children in education to any school they wanted their children to attend, even private schools. But King wanted an entire school jurisdiction to volunteer to carry out the experiment. He would not initiate it himself. Alberta Hansard, 1981. The Holderman Mennonite school case. Aside from the funding increase and the creation of alternative schools, the PC government showed itself favorable to the private schools through the creation of a new category of private schools. This was the result of a court case won by a parent whose children attended a new religious private school. Once again, the PC government proved its support for private alternatives to the public education system. The November 1975, the Holderman Mennonites of Linden applied to the Department of Education to have a private school for grades 2 to 9 called Nihil Christian School. The following month, they were refused approval because three of their proposed teachers were not certified and the curriculum they planned to use was American. Nevertheless, the Holdermans told the department in May 1976 that they would open their school in September 1977. At least 6 other Holderman communities in Alberta were planning to take similar action at this time. Wolf, 1980. The ATA was concerned about this situation and adopted a resolution at its April 1977 convention urging the provincial government and school boards to prevent the establishment of independent schools. Wolf, 1980, page 84. However, the government did not appear anxious to pursue legal action against the Holdmans, and in June 1977, the ATA lawyers wrote to Attorney General Foster demanding that he take action against the proposed schools. He replied that he did not intend to do so. As a result, it was the Three Hills School District that decided to initiate legal action in September 1977. By the time the case came to court in November, however, the Attorney General had taken over prosecution of the case. As well, although all parents who sent their children to the now operating illegal school were charged, it was decided that only one parent, Elmer Wiebe, would be tried as a test case. Wolf, 1980. Wiebe was charged with violating the attendance provision of the School Act by not having his children in a recognized school or having superintendent of schools certify that his children were receiving efficient instruction. Although Wiebe's defense had 3 main arguments, it was on the basis of only one that he was acquitted: religious freedom. It was argued that the Alberta Bill of Rights granted freedom of religion and that teaching his children according to his religious belief was an aspect of freedom of religion. Judge Oliver accepted this argument, Bergen 1981, and thus the Holdmans could continue operating their school. Aftermath of the decision. Much of the press response was critical. The Calgary Herald called for the government to appeal the ruling, Mennonite ruling 1978. A columnist in the Albertan saw the decision as opening the door to a fragmentation of society, with each religious group demanding its own schools, hospitals, and even prisons. Tucker, 1978. One editorialist in the Edmonton Journal saw the support for parental rights in this decision as possibly making every child in Alberta the unconscious prisoner of his parents and their beliefs. Thorsell, 1978. Another writer in the same paper said the ruling cruelly slammed the door of a lightless prison on generations and generations of people most concerned, the youngsters. Horton, 1978. Clearly there was media opposition to the decision. The ATA shared this opposition and advised that the Minister of Education to appeal the decision, Wolf, 1980. Instead of appealing the decision, however, the government changed the regulations for private schools to include a category of private schools that could use uncertified teachers. These Category 4 private schools would also be ineligible for government funding. Category 1 schools used certified teachers and received funding. Category 2 schools were for handicapped children, and Category 3 schools were language schools that operate outside regular school hours. The government also decided to compensate public school systems that would lose schools to a newly formed private school to the tune of 100% of the per pupil grant for the first year and 50% for the following year. Alberta Hansard, 1978. When asked by NDP leader Grant Notley why the government did not refer the case to the Supreme Court, Premier Lougheed replied that because the case had been won on the basis of the Alberta Bill of Rights, which had been passed by the Alberta legislature, the case should not be appealed by the government. Alberta, Hansard, 1978. In 1979, the government amended the Department of Education Act to ensure that the Category 4 schools would fit properly in the legislation. Alberta Hansard, 1979. Thus, the Holdman Mennonites were from the threat of a lost legal battle to having their concerns accommodated in Alberta laws. By creating a new category of private schools, the PC government clearly made a more accommodating environment for private schools. This was done in spite of calls from the opposition and media for the government to appeal the court decision. It seemed that the government must have been supportive of more parental choice in education, at least to some degree. This perspective is consistent with its actions regarding alternative schools and private school funding. Increased attention on private schools. With the increase in government funding for private schools and the Holdman school case, private school issue were receiving public attention. The perception that private schools were growing also began to emerge. According to Statistics Canada, enrollment in private schools in Alberta remained consistent from 1974 to 1975 school year to the 1979 to 1980 school year at 1.3% of the school total enrollment. However, it increased every year thereafter until it leveled off in 1986 to 1987, but then began increasing again in 1989 to 1990 from 1.3% of students in 1979 to 1980, private school enrollments increased steadily to 3% in 1986, 1987, more than doubling in 7 years. Statistics Canada, 1992. This notable increase helped to draw attention to issues related to private schools. This attention led to a number of studies of private education in Alberta. The Alberta School Trustees Association, ASTA, commissioned a study in 1979 by University of Alberta education professor Bergen, and he completed it in June 1980. He noted that some school boards had experienced a drop in enrollment because of the growth of private schools, and that a number of school boards expected further growth in private school enrollments in their areas. Bergen, 1980. The Minister of Education, Dave King, commissioned a report on private schools to be conducted by Woods Gordon Management Consultants in 1983. This report, completed in December 1984, recommended that private schools be allowed to continue operating in Alberta. However, it recommended that Category 4 be abolished. All private schools would need to conform to one of the other three categories. There would be a strict control over curriculum and teacher qualification, but private schools would continue to receive government funds. Thus, government control over private schools would be tightened. This was in contrast to a report sponsored by two private organizations that called for the preservation of Category 4 and considerable freedom for private schools, Rannigan and New, 1985. As it turned out, this report was closer to the government's thinking than even the government's own study conducted by Woods Gordon. In mid-1983, the Minister of Education also created the Committee on Tolerance and Understanding, chaired by former PCMLA Ron Gitter. This was Dave King's response to the Keekstra affair, where a public school social studies teacher, James Keekstra, was found to be teaching about an alleged international Jewish conspiracy. The Gitter Committee was to suggest ways to foster greater tolerance in the school system. Although it was set up due to a problem in a public school, much of its work focused on private schools. The committee released a discussion paper on private education in May 1984. This paper was critical of private religious schools and expressed the concern that the public education system could become fragmented and eroded by an accelerated growth of the private school system. Getter et al., 1984a, page 15. It recommended that Category 4 schools be abolished and that Category 1 schools be placed under the jurisdiction of local school boards and following strict departmental and school board requirements. It is not clear how these schools could then be called private. However, committee's final report, completed in December 1984, called for less stringent control over these Category 1 schools, allowing them to exist much as before. Gitter et al., 1984b. Yet Category 4 schools would still be eliminated. With the release of Gitter report and the Woods Gordon report, there was ample opportunity for the government to take action to tighten controls over private schools if it wished. Indeed, these schools seem to encourage such a move. However, the government continued to deal with the private schools in a much more cautious fashion. By this time, the School Act was being rewritten and the government maintained in the new Act provisions for the Category 4 variety, even though the two reports it commissioned had recommended that such schools be abolished. This again seems to indicate that the government was favorably disposed to private schools. The New School Act. Throughout much of the 1980s, the government was drafting a new school act, which was finally completed in 1988. The government originally stated its intention to rewrite the act in the speech from the throne in March 1982, but it was not until March 1984 that the Minister of Education formed a committee of government MLAs to assist him in that task. After receiving submissions from the public and stakeholders groups, the committee released a discussion paper entitled Partners in Education, Principles for a New School Act in January 1985, Wagner 1998. At the news conference held to release the paper, Dave King emphasized the importance of choice in education. He was quoted as saying, "In education, we believe that the choice is as important as it is in the aisles of Safeway." Principles, 1985. Partners in education like the Wood, Gordon, and Gitter report recommended that Category 4 schools be abolished. There would be only one category of private schools, and those schools would all need to follow an approved program of studies, employ teachers deemed qualified by the government. They would also be eligible to receive a per pupil grant from the government. Alberta Education 1985. Both private school supporters and opponents of private school funding were unhappy with this proposal. The private school supporters saw it as being too restrictive, and the opponents of private school funding were concerned about the document's support for continued funding. In the public debate about the new School Act, private school funding received considerable attention. One group, Save Public Education, SPE, even spent $20,000 on full-page advertisements in 8 Alberta daily newspapers to rally public opposition. The leader of SPE, Sheldon Schumer, was especially concerned that the growth of private schools in Alberta was leading towards a segregated society. Wagner, 1998. The provincial election of 1986, Schumer was elected as a Liberal MLA from Calgary. He became the Liberal education critic and continued to emphasize the issue of private school funding. With reference to the decision by government to fund private schools, Schumer said, "I believe this change is the most important change in education policy in the history of our province." Alberta Hansard, 1986, page 886. The result of this funding has been tremendous growth in the number of private schools, mainly religious-based, over the last 10 years. This is a formula for future social division, page 886. The first draft of the proposed No School Act, Bill 59, was not released until June 1987. By this time, Nancy Bukowski was Minister of Education. With regard to private schools, the government had decided to maintain 2 different classifications that reflected the Category 1 and 4 schools they had implemented in 1978. The equivalent of Category 1 was to be called accredited, and the equivalent of Category 4 was to be called registered. 2 classifications were maintained in spite of calls for the abolition of Category 4 from the Partner of Education, the Gitter Committee, and the Woods-Gordon report. Gitter then stated his concern that the registered private schools would be able to get away with using inadequate and prejudiced curricula and be able to employ unqualified teachers. The president of the ATA, Nadine Thomas, believes that the private school provisions would encourage the spread of private schools throughout the province. However, some private school supporters were not happy with Bill 59 either. They were concerned that it gave too much discretion to the minister in dealing with private schools, discretion that could ultimately be used against them. Kosh, 1987. With the widespread opposition to Bill 59, largely for reasons not associated with the private school provisions, it was scrapped and a new one, Bill 27, was introduced in 1988. Its preamble contained an explicit recognition of parental rights in education and also made other accommodations to private schools, such as allowing more flexibility in the use of curricula. This clearly excited private school supporters. Byfield, 1988. In the legislative debates about this bill, the issue of private school was especially controversial. NDP leader Ray Martin criticized the government's plans for continued funding of private schools, saying that the government was implementing what we might classify as a modified voucher system. Alberta Hansard, 1988, page 1823. In discussing this support for the bill from the publisher of Alberta Report, he mentioned an even more threatening scenario. Now the Minister of Education has her ally, Mr. Ted Byfield, who thinks this is a great thing because it's the end of public education and the start of private education. Alberta Hansard, 1988, page 1823. The Liberals were also strongly opposed to Bill 27. Sheldon Schumer, in particular, hammered away at the issue of private schools. In his view, the overall philosophy of the legislation was the privatization of schools. Alberta Hansard, 1988, page 2111. In Schumer's view, this was not just another issue among many. Members may have noted that I focused a great deal on this particular issue of private schooling. We deal in many issues in this province and in the legislature. However, it's my judgment that there is no single issue we deal with that we have the power of decisions with respect to that will have more impact on our society over the next 50 years than the shape of our school system. Alberta Hansard, 1988, page 2121. However, he was unable to stop the bill or make the changes to it that he desired. Some educators also saw the new School Act as favoring private education. During 1988, the resource consultant for the Edmonton Learner Center wrote an article critical of the new act. In her view, the act showed that the government was now seems to envisage education as just another commodity to be placed on the open market, page 104. She saw the act as including privatizing sections which will inevitably lead to a two-tiered education system favoring the well-to-do, page 102. Duren refers to a clear right-wing move by the Minister of Education to endorse a bill that gave both private and homeschooling identical status with existing public and separate schools, page 100. In a number of respects, she said the final act echoes the sentiments of private school supporters, page 100. It was clear to her that the new School Act represented a major gain for supporters of private alternatives to public education. Many themes of her critique of the 1988 School Act would reappear as critiques of the charter schools under the Klein government's education restructuring 6 years later. There can be little doubt that the new School Act adopted by the PC government in 1988 was more favorable to educational choice than any previous piece of legislation in the province's history. Supporters of private education lobbied hard to expand the rights in the new legislation, and they were successful. The attitude of the PC government in this instant was completely different from the opposition Liberals and New Democrats. The PCs consciously chose to expand educational choice in the face of opposition's bitter criticism. Indeed, at least some members of the opposition saw the new School Act as putting the province on the road to privatization of the education system. This same allegation would again be thrown at the Klein government's year later as a result of its 1994 amendments to the School Act, as was demonstrated earlier. But the Klein changes were just an elaboration of the educational choice options already supported by the previous PC administrations, and the continuity is quite evident. Homeschooling. The recent growth of homeschooling has largely been accommodated by, and some would say encouraged by, the PC government. Homeschooling was included in the 1988 School Act, the first time it was explicitly dealt with in legislation in Alberta. Interesting, the School Act stipulated that home education students must be supervised by a board, but did not specify which school board a parent must choose. Parents are free to choose any school board in the province of Alberta to monitor their program. Clendening, 1996, page 35. This gave rise to a phenomenon of the willing non-resident board, whereby homeschoolers could shop around and register with the school board most willing to accommodate their needs. The boards would receive the per pupil grant for each child of $2,100 to $2,500, depending on the child's age. Some of the board would return a portion of its money to the homeschooling parents. This non-resident provision enabled small rural boards with little money to improve the financial situation by catering to homeschoolers outside their jurisdiction. In 1993, 34% of homeschoolers were registered with non-resident boards, Hatton, 1993. Some homeschoolers attributed the rapid rise of their movement to this non-residency provision in the School Act, Jenkins, 1993. Indeed, as Benson Evans, 1997, suggested, it was possible to see the growth of home education this way. Rather than Alberta having the largest number of people in Canada wanting to homeschool their children, it is legislation and funding that plays a critical role in promoting this trend, page 261. And the move was towards accommodating schooling occurred years before the Klein government, once again demonstrating the continuity of school choice as an emphasis in PC education policy. Charter schools. It was with these policy precedents that the Klein government undertook to provide the charter schools in Alberta's School Act in 1994. Accordingly, and to the Alberta Department of Education Charter School Handbook, charter schools are autonomous public schools which provide innovative or enhanced means of delivering education to improve student learning. Alberta Education, 1996, page 1. A group of people with a particular education philosophy is granted permission to operate a publicly funded school with a particular education focus. Parents who send their children to the school must agree with the focus. Friedman, 1995. A physician or recognized leader of the charter school movement in Alberta defines charter schools as following. A charter school is a public school in every sense of the word, but it is done in a different way. Instead of being run by the usual school board, charter schools are created under an alternative legal framework that allows them to be fully autonomous while retaining all of the values of public education. A document that spells out their characteristics and operating conditions must be approved by the government in advance. Once approved, this document becomes the authorizing charter. Charter schools are granted relief from much of the regulation paralyzing public schools, and they receive full funding from every school enrolled. Page 15. Opponents of charter schools would certainly take issue with some of Freeman's comments, in particular to say that charter schools are public schools in every sense of the word is questionable. Although Alberta is unique in the sense of being the only Canadian province to have charter schools, the idea for charter schools came from other jurisdictions. Britain's Education Reform Act of 1988 authorized the creation of autonomous public schools called grant-maintained schools. Similarly, with the abolition of school boards in New Zealand in 1989, all of the country's schools became charter schools, Friedman, 1995. The charter idea jumped to North America in 1991, beginning in Minnesota. California followed, then Colorado, then Massachusetts, and other, until 19 states passed charter legislation. Subsequently, the charter idea spread north across the border to the province of Alberta, page 13. Alberta then is unique only in the Canadian context. In some sense, charter schools resemble private schools or perhaps even blur the boundary between public and private schools. They are operated by a private organization rather than a school board, and the people who run the schools are not elected by local citizens. As well, they do not offer the same educational programs as the regular public schools. Thus, they are an alternative to regular public schools and thereby provide a different choice for parents. This was one of the important reasons for making room for charter schools. That is, to give parents more options for the education of their children. The Charter School Handbook, Alberta Education, 1996, gives as one of the 5 main purposes of charter schools to provide parents and students with greater opportunities for choice within the public education system. Page 5. Importantly, however, charter schools cannot charge a fee other than that allowed to a school board and cannot be affiliated with a religious faith or denomination. School Amendment Act 1994, subsection 224.34. Another limitation includes the regulations restrict the number of charter schools to a maximum of 15. This feature should alleviate to some degree the fears of those concerned about the spread of charter schools. By September 1997, only 11 charter schools had opened. Benton Evans, 1997. Nevertheless, it was the private school characteristics of charter schools that led some critics to see them as the beginning of privatization of education in Alberta. Conclusion. In spite of the rhetoric of those who say that education policy of the Klein government is a dramatic move towards the privatization of education in Alberta, in reality, the changes in this area have been incremental. Charter schools do not constitute a radical break with previous policies. Those who claim that charter schools will lead to the end of public education in the province should remember that the same charge was thrown at the New School Act of 1998. Indeed, some public education supporters were concerned about the PC government's favorable stance towards private education years before that. The progressive Conservative government had been supportive of choice in education right from the start. This is not to say that the PCs came to power with an agenda to promote private schools and other alternatives, but whenever this issue has arisen in its various forms, the government has come out on the same side of the question. Whether it is alternative schools, private school funding, homeschool, or charter schools, the PC government has made educational choice available. Thus, the provision for charter schools is part of a broader framework of openness to alternatives to the traditional form of public education and should not be seen as a new direction for the Alberta government to take. Indeed, if there is any area where the continuity of PC education is clear, this is it. Whether one considers official government documents, the statements of education ministers, or even the government's critics, there is an unbroken consistency from the 1970s through the 1990s that the Conservative government has favored private education and educational choice. In this sense, it is incorrect to see charter schools as a completely novel approach of the Klein government. That is the end. You can find the text for this article online. I've posted it below. Again, the title of this is Charter Schools in Alberta, Change or Continuity in Progressive Conservative Education Policy, ? By Dr. Michael Wagner, as published in the Alberta Journal of Educational Research, spring 1999, page 52 to 66. Thank you.